this thing. My books live here, but I think most of you guys have heard, yes, Luke has books. But I want you to know about Lauren, who we'll introduce in a second, books. So, this link in the pinned comment will take you to this book, which is Lauren Ducrey's book that came out a little bit, I think July of last year?
November.
November of last year.
2021.
So it's,
Yep.
brand spanking new, off the presses. We are here with Lauren Ducrey,
Thank you for having me.
who just rolled up to our poetry at Karuna. And not an uncommon thing for someone we've never met to roll up, but she came carrying Poetic Mischief.
Yes.
Not only a book of poetry, but she does really cool things with like printing out these poetry cards. What are these?
Yeah, I make these poetry cards. They're inspired by words whose origins I find surprising or interesting. So each word has 2 cards. One card has the etymology, and another card has a poem inspired by the etymology.
Mm-hmm.
So I like to give them out to people and see if they're surprised and
That's so cool.
spread the bits.
Okay, so I'll let you introduce yourself. This is my author page. I'm a really good community of supportive people on a lot of fronts. So who are you and what are you doing in Guatemala?
Great question. Hi everyone. Hi Luke's followers. So my name's Lauren. I'm based in New York City, grew up in France. So have been living between languages and words for a long time at this point. And yeah, I started writing poetry, I'd say about 5 years ago. I studied literature for a long time. So a lot of passion for the written word, but it always felt a bit distant from my personal life. I was always like analyzing it, writing essays, dissertations, things like that. And honestly, poetry was not my favorite genre.
What?
Yeah, I know.
You guys believe this? Get out of here.
Yeah. Okay, fine. Yeah, I found it, beautiful, but quite mysterious.
Uh-huh.
It was that kind of typical, like, I just don't really get what's going on here.
Maybe some of you guys can relate.
Yeah, I know that a lot of my friends have that same approach. We're like, yeah, it just seems, what does this poem mean?
Mm-hmm.
So novels were something that spoke to me a bit more, but that changed when I started writing poetry.
Mm-hmm.
And that happened, there are kind of 2 main reasons, I'd say. There was a breakup, which, breaks things open.
Oh, yeah.
So there were things to be...
Many a poetry has come from breakups.
Yeah, it's somewhat of a cliche, but it's true. And then I started doing morning pages.
Uh-huh.
So writing every morning.
Cameron, is that?
Julia Cameron, exactly. And the idea is that you wake up and kind of like first thing, stream of consciousness, you write, it's either 3-page by like hand or 750 words if you're typing. And what was interesting with that is that I was doing it on my computer. And around, I'd say like 600 words, I'd run out of kind of like my dreams or like what I've planned for today, these kind of like narrative bits. And I'd find myself literally playing with words. And I was like, okay, this is interesting. And I started taking those pieces out and kind of realizing I think this is poetry. And from there, signed up for workshops in New York. Shout out to Brooklyn Poets, who definitely...
Brooklyn Poets, where are you guys? Get on here.
Yeah, transform my craft from something very draft-like to a proper practice.
I used to be a Brooklyn poet, so that's great.
Yeah, they're amazing. And yeah, that's a long story to say that it all led me to self-publish my first book recently.
So like anyone can do this. Like
anyone can do this.
You don't have any magic unicorn powers, and you didn't even used to really get poetry, and yet you put out this.
I went from not really understanding poetry to writing it most days and putting out this book with the help of 2 amazing artists that I do want to mention here. So all the drawings, like this one here and like this one here, are by a dear friend and French artist called Erwan Ile de Beauchesne.
He sounds French.
Yeah. And then the graphic design of all of this, and there's so much. There's like these let's see, where are the double pages? Things like this was set up by my friend David Cocciante, who's an amazing graphic artist. So self-publishing was also an amazing opportunity for that creative collaboration and just having complete agency over that.
And self-publishing, we talk about a little bit here. Most of my books have been self-published, and it's this part of this state we find ourselves in as artists that I think we don't have any gatekeepers. You know, we can still get through the big gates of big publishing or a record deal or whatever it is, but that, I think we're so used to that being the path that we're still settling into this this brave new world of publishing, where it's like you can do everything on your own. You can get copy editors, you can get people to read over your work, you can get artists, you know, to collaborate with you. So we have the ability to do all the things that we used to need others to do. Just even this phone that we're broadcasting on, like I can record music on this and put it up in the world. And yes, it might not sound as good as $1,000 an hour studio in Brooklyn, say, but I'm also not going to $1,000 an hour studio in Brooklyn to get like music out in the world. So that's pretty cool. So Gerard says, hello, Brooklyn. He says, hello, Lauren. Hare Krishna. And if you guys have any questions at any point for Lauren, please leave it here. Let's see. Yeah, thank you, Sean. Hi, Lauren and Luke. Love those cards. Yay. Yeah, they're great. Hello, Amanda. Yeah, so we're planning on just having a fun, poetic conversation. I want to read some of Lauren's work to her and ask some questions. We're gonna kind of do like a poet off thing. So she's gonna read a few of mine and maybe ask me some questions. But I wanted to read to you the intro to my first book of poetry because I really like it. I saw like you're very funny in your poetry as well. Like there's some things, but it's the sort of humor that it's like you're like, ah, ha, 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 we're all having fun and laughing, but then you drop people into this depth and drop them in like a well of truth, and it's like, ah, she tricked us. I thought she was funny, but now she's like deep and philosophical.
Thank you. That's what I'm trying to do. I'm glad it landed.
So we have some questions before we continue. Tammy Clark says, do you have a favorite poem?
Write from dreams.
And then Lori says, do you ever write from dreams? I've had some amazing dreams. I've woken up to and started writing. So I'll let you respond to that. They hear from me enough.
I do want to hear, I think, about dreams from your perspective. Favorite poem, super hard question. But one, I'm currently rereading, just living with Mary Oliver's book, Felicity. And I can share a short one.
Yeah, they're all short.
It's, actually very true. I don't know, is it my favorite? I don't know. It definitely hits home for me. I think, yes, this is the one. I think it would either be this one or another one that comes to mind that I often share with people, also because I find his writing so accessible. Same as Mary Oliver. I think anybody can read this, truly. Kind of transcends that issue of like, what does this mean? The other poem I have in mind is, I think it's called How to Be Alone by Padraig Ó Tuama, who's a beautiful Irish poet, and he also has the podcast Poetry Unbound, which I highly recommend, again, especially for people trying to like just get into poetry. It's 10-15 minutes episodes, and he reads the poem, kind of interprets the poem, and reads the poem again. So it's a beautiful way of kind of, being offered like a railing to enter into a poem. But today, as a favorite poem, or at least of right now, I'll share this one. It's called Nothing is Too Small Not to Be Wondered About. The cricket doesn't wonder if there's a heaven, or if there is, if there's room for him. It's fall. Romance is over. Still, he sings. If he can, he enters a house through the tiniest crack under the door. Then the house grows colder. He sings slower and slower. Then, nothing. This must mean something. I don't know what. But certainly it doesn't mean he hasn't been an excellent cricket all his life. And I'm like, it's tragic, it's funny,
Yeah,
it's true, it's simple.
I read this book a couple times late last year, and that one spoke to me as well. It's
Wow.
like, and you realize, yeah, crickets, they're just having a blast. They're playing
The music?
their glass violins all the time, and they're not worried about if there's a heaven or if there's space for them there.
Just being crickets.
Hmm. So Laurie says that
Yeah.
cuts deep. Simply though, like
Simply.
that's an interesting question. It's like would be asking, how does it cut so deep? You know.
Yeah.
And Rumi often talks about not listening to his words, but finding that place behind the words that the words come from. He specifically says to find the presence, behind the words.
I love that.
All right, so I'll read the
Yes.
foreword. Simply because at 25, I articulated my thoughts on poetry that now 11 years later, like I still feel the same way about it. I feel like, yeah, that's what's going on. And some of it has somehow already become dated, like my Jonas Brother references. They're not. The Jonas Brothers, I don't know if you guys remember 11 years ago, but they were huge.
Yep, they were.
Okay. This is a poetry book. If you are reading this right now, I am surprised. I am shocked. I am jolted that there is nothing good on TV, that your Wii is not more tempting, or that you would not instead enjoy managing fantasy football or taking a walk. Sure you would not rather read the Twilight Saga? Face it, if you do not read the Twilight Saga, you and your prom date are going to have very little to talk about. If you have ever listened to poets talking about poetry, right now we're doing it. When we consume alcohol, we tend to rant. You'll discover that we feel a little left out. We see the Jonas Brothers rocking out and filling up stadiums of screaming teenage girls, while us poets sit on coffee shop stools and look out at an embarrassing acreage of 5 pale faces who have come to our poetry reading. Usually all 5 in attendance are our moms. And our fans don't ask for our autographs or offer to marry us. They criticize us. They have degrees and they know how to use them. They say things like unbalanced metric devices or postmodern progressivism in a tired form. They say these things about our verses that we put our souls into. Those critical jerk faces. Our souls. Qui es veritus? For God's sake, pourquoi? These are verses that are our final stab at getting the world to understand our epic struggles, and they criticize. Admittedly, these epic struggles often only equal, I really, really like this girl, but she is not into me. She's all into Mr. Rico Suave with his greasy hair and superior salsa skills. Or, I really like this girl, but she's holding out for one of the Jonas Brothers. And what am I supposed to do? Just sit around and wait for her as her fallback while she makes kissy faces at those jerk-faced Jonas Brothers? People nowadays want clarity. Poets seem to want the opposite. We take simple things and make them complicated. Instead of saying, the hamburger was really big and I ate it all and it is not helping me with my weight problem, we pesky poets prefer something like, a once walking beast that spent its meadow days grazing and gazing at the world, now stoic, cold, dead, reheated, sitting between what harvest and manufacturing has done to the wheat fields, sitting between shavings of lettuce and cut tomatoes, the mustard withheld, sitting between what would bring us life, its death, now divided into quarter-pound patties, enlivening my body, the proteins appreciated, its fat accumulating in unappreciated rolls. Lo, I consume it whole. Then, just when you think we are done and you are bored, we are just starting. Oh, lament to the withheld mustard, lament. Lament that my father denied me mustard for many a sorrowful year, that saucy yellow perfection, that my father, unconcerned about my mustard proclivity, that he placed beyond my hopeful reach, even but a dreary mouthful for my tender tongue, my soul. So us poets like our verbiage. Hell, we even know what the word verbiage means. And if we don't, we pretend we do and we make our way to the nearest restroom. Then we lock ourselves in a stall, take out our pocket dictionary from where we stuffed it in our underpants, and frantically look for verbiage's definition. We are all English majors who aspired to be Shakespeare's, and when that failed, we aspired to be Hemingway's, and when that failed, most of us decided between having drug problems and becoming English teachers. That's why your high school English teacher was so cranky. She was not only not Shakespeare, she chose teaching you not to end your sentences with a preposition instead of hitting a bong with tie-dyed friends with names like Star, Chibuz, and Bob Marley. If you skimmed over the first part, let's sum up what we've established. Most people don't read poetry for fun. Plenty of poets aren't too keen about that fact. Many poems are a cleverly cloaked way for complainers to complain. People like clarity. Poems tend to get all wordy and verbial. 5. Verbial is not a word. Only English majors know that. It is likely that poetry was first presented to you via your high school English teacher, and we've already established that she was a drug addict. And you know that you cannot trust drug addicts. Poetry and poets are not perfect, but nothing is, not even the youngest Jonas brother. Poetry will never be able to compete with skydiving or juggling fire, and reading about falling in love is thus compared to actually falling in love. To the kindest of critics, poetry is probably only on par with juggling knives. And yet, people have been writing poetry and juggling knives for a long time. So maybe there is something here. After all, even Shakespeare dressed up like a woman and juggled knives on the weekends. In publishing a poetry book, I accept that maybe only 7 people, all of whom are my mother, sorry, because my mom, I don't think she's really into my poetry books, will purchase copies. And my mother will not like the poem To the Fathers of the Daughters Who End Up in My Bedroom one bit. But that's the thing about us poets. We just like writing poetry. So we do. We put the most palpable parts of ourselves inside what we write, and we send those verses off to sea in a bottle, hoping someone will stumble upon it and say, I'm with you on that one. So there's one more paragraph, but it's not important. So that was sort of my take. It's like, okay, we are just doing this thing, and we can't really stop it, so we might as well embrace it and do it in the best way, which it seems you've done by putting out a book. So I would love to hear your thoughts on that, your own manifesto on poetry, and like what's going on? What are you doing? What am I doing? What are we doing with this poetry
What are we
stuff?
doing here? Wow, there's so much in that. That was really funny. I think I kind of heard that forward as like both that kind of like rant about like poetry being very wordy and like not getting recognition the same way that like musicians do, or fame being something quite rare, or more rare for poets than like other types of artistic performance. Like both of that rant, but also kind of like an ironic comment on it in a certain way. Because like I'm very passionate about undermining kind of like that view, you know, that poetry is necessarily super complicated, right? Like that Mary Oliver poem, I think gets to the truth in like super simple way. And I'm sure there was like a lot of work that went into distilling what she wanted to say in such simple words. And I think that's maybe part of the bitterness, because you can't really be recognized for all that work that's happening in the background, right? Like all the drafts that you write and that you skim until you get to like the core of it. But I'm quite passionate about the idea that poetry like doesn't have to be so complicated. And even like in that like funny poem that you wrote about the hamburger, it gets to something else, right? Like you talk about like your dad in it. So it's like you're saying something else than just the hamburger.
And in case my dad's watching, my dad never prevented me from eating mustard. That was all fiction.
Dads were not mistreated in the creation of this poem. And I think that's what I love about poetry, is that you can start writing almost like without even having like a clear idea in mind. You can start writing about like the rocks that I'm seeing here, and they'll give way to something else, like a bigger consideration about family, about love, about like life. And that freedom of expression, I think, just seems quite approachable. You don't have to have a plan necessarily when you're writing, so you don't have a plan when you're reading poetry either. You can be surprised by what you're going to discover. And yeah, I think that approachability and like trusting, which is hard for me, definitely when you're talking about being introduced to poetry through school, that was my introduction. And it was more about like learning poems by heart. It's like the perfection of reciting
So
a poem.
did that speak to you at all, that class? Were you like thrilled,
No.
or just like it was just schoolwork?
Like, I guess it's not like a complete no, but it was more about like memorizing poems by heart.
You weren't like into it. You weren't like looking forward to class.
It
Like,
wasn't, I don't think it was very inspiring to me.
so isn't that like ironic that someone who went on to love poetry so much that she put out a book of it,
Yeah.
like the way it was presented to you in your schooling did not like
Yeah.
capture you in any way? Because like if
Yeah.
anyone should be captured, it's like the students like you that have that potentiality within them.
Honestly, I remember like the most inspiring part is that so we'd write the poem on one side of our notebook. There was these poem notebooks in France, so lined on one side and a blank page on the other side, so that we could illustrate the poem. So you'd also be graded on your drawings, which was kind of wild. But
I
that
would've
was
gotten an F.
I was like, that's really hard. But my best friend at the time was this, and still is an amazing artist, and so I was kind of inspired. Like she'd have these really creative interpretations of the poem, and I think that was the closest that I got to kind of the richness of a poem being many things. Like I think a poem has as many versions as it has readers
Interesting.
because they're not like closed, right? I think because of the space, because of what makes people uncomfortable and like what does it mean, I think that discomfort comes from the fact that poems are very open.
Huh.
They're
Okay.
not I'm eating a hamburger,
Yeah.
full stop, which doesn't give you much space to like, okay, so you're eating a hamburger, what can I do with that?
Yeah.
Everybody's gonna read that the same
Doesn't
way.
give us anything. Yeah. It's
And
just information.
Yeah. And I think that was the most inspiring part, was the
So
drawing part.
Poems use information, but they're digging at something deeper than the information.
Yeah, I think that this is not, I'm kind of borrowing these words from
They're all made up, you know, and all borrowed.
It's
All the
so
words,
true.
yeah.
These I'd say are more directly borrowed from Claire Morgan, who I cite constantly. She founded the creative writing MFA at Oxford, and I was lucky to meet her at this conference where she did a poetry workshop that was really inspiring. But she says that poetry basically like uses language to get beyond language. So kind of to your point, it's like
Poetry uses language
to get beyond language, to get to like emotion, like the worlds that usually kind of live outside of language. Actually, somebody asked a question about dreams, and that's kind of what she speaks to, is that she uses language, which we use in like this, you know, waking, rational, kind of like sense-making life, to get to that place that exists in dreams, where like you might go to sleep with a problem and you'll wake up in the morning with a solution. You didn't like strategize that solution,
Yeah.
but there's a part of you that did, and that's the part that I think poetry speaks to
Okay.
through language, which we all can use. It's just kind of amazing.
And so my next intro of my subsequent poetry book, I sort of say the same. I repeat the same thing, but then I talk about how in our times of short attention spans, like I don't know how many people are sitting down and reading War and Peace. You should. It's like, people are like, it's the best novel ever. I'm like, psh, and then I read it and I'm like, it's the best novel ever.
I haven't read it.
You know, you have time.
On my list.
You have
Yeah.
time. But like, that's a big commitment, you know. That's like, even if you're a fast reader, and I'm not, I'm a pretty slow reader actually. You know, you're looking at 4 or 5 months of your life and you're reading this book, whereas like you can put, you know, you could order this. It's in the pinned comment. Oh wait, did it not get pinned? Okay, we're gonna pin this. Paste, tongue tied.
I'm like learning as I watch.
So then this just keeps it. I think I have to unpin this comment. Unpin. So that one comes up automatically.
Got it.
But I think you guys are like, we get it, Luke. You got a novel.
It's a great
We've
example
either
of
got, okay, so
a
there we go.
tech-savvy poet.
Well, I'm getting there. So like this, you can put on the back of your toilet, and every time you sit on your toilet, have a full immersive experience with something that has a beginning and an end. You'd have to sit on your toilet a long time to read War and Peace, like months on your toilet. Nobody wants you to sit for months on your toilet. So that's sort of the,
Yeah.
you know, it appeals to, and the way we were talking in poetry, how I I sort of crossed the threshold. You guys see me put like reels of my poems up on this space and up on Instagram. So I was reluctant at first because I'm like, no, I'm an ancient antique dinosaur and I just want to do it like it's always done. But it's actually quite enriching to see how many teenagers are on Instagram putting out their work in the world. And yeah, albeit a lot of it's about like unrequited love, but like what else is there to write about when you're a teenager? What else is so compelling and moving all this stuff inside than that in that phase of life? So yeah, like poetry, music, songs, like it's funny because a really popular hashtag that I'll use sometimes is called "Poetry is not dead."
Yeah, I use that one too.
It's like, actually, not only is it not dead, but it's living
Coming
richer
back.
than it ever has.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
and yes, it used to be in newspapers and stuff like that, but yeah, there'll always be a space and a place for it. And like you met Roberto in Poetry, and he's really thrilled that there's younger poets that like his work that are like, you just keep writing poetry in your notebook, Roberto. We're gonna put it in these little libritos or put it online and like send it out to the world. So, and I think so March 12th is the next time we will be. Okay, Lori says I just ordered
Thank you,
the
Lori.
last book, Lauren, on Amazon.
I think there's actually more. Just I did see like 2 left, but I think there are more.
Yeah, and it's on Barnes and Noble too. So don't give up. Keep trying. And like, there's nothing more thrilling, I know, because I'm often in the thrill of this when writers get to connect with people that are actually speaking to them in real time and are interested in their work. So it seems like a good time to share one of your poems now.
Sure.
There was one I wanted to specifically visit.
Yeah, and to that point, the way that we designed the book, there's like these big quotes on certain of the pages. And yeah, to your point of like short attention span, I mean, I do approach poetry as kind of like a meditation, right? Like you can just read one poem and really sit with it for like a moment. That's kind of the point of these double pages. It's like it gives you a break to just focus on one sentence. That's it.
And what's funny is, so the poem that this line comes from appears prior to this in the book.
Yeah.
So I didn't know that this was a large print, and I was just sort of writing the things that stood out to me, and that line, like, demoted from being me, promoted to being anyone. So I saw that as like a compelling like distillation of the poem in some essence of what it's saying. And then I was like, oh, felt like I got it right on the test because then it showed up in a big way on
But
it.
I love that.
I
love
was
that
like,
that
oh
was the
yeah,
order.
that was
Nice.
that was great.
Yeah. Yes, this is a test. This book is graded.
Okay. Not that one. Is this the one that has like the paintbrushes and stuff?
This bit.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So it's a longer poem.
is
You guys
longer.
love poetry, right? So thank you, Jared. He says, great conversation. Have a beautiful day.
Me too.
Okay, we got people checking out your books. And Gerard says, my mother drew a distinction between achievement and success. She said that achievement is the knowledge that you have studied and worked hard and done the best you can. Success is being praised by others. That is nice, but not as important or satisfying. Always aim for achievement and forget about success. Helen Hayes. And we were sort of talking about that before we went live, sort of about, to detach from the outcome of the work.
Yeah.
Because that's the thing we can't control. We're about to have our first theater circus day, and one of the things I was saying to Aviva, who's hosting it, it's a new thing, you're worried, are people going to show up? What if nobody does? I said, I think the key to the events here from my perspective is if nobody shows up for poetry, I'm thrilled that I've blocked out 2 hours of my day every week to sit and drink tea and read poetry.
Yeah.
So there's no pressure for me like I'm trying to please the crowd. I've simply found something that I love in the world, found myself in a space where I can offer it to the world. So I open the door to the world, but I don't get so troubled if the world doesn't come in one day or ever or never, because I think it's fulfilling enough for me. So I think wherever this book goes, you must feel you've achieved something. You battled all the doubts, the demon voices of doubt
Yes.
that
Yeah.
Probably
sure.
gave you plenty of reasons to stop, or that
Yeah.
it was frivolous or a waste of your time and talents. But it's here.
It's here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We got Wendy Summers. So Wendy Summers has a very talented 17-year-old son who also writes poetry.
Well,
Maybe Wendy, you'll
yeah.
post one of his poems.
I'd love to read it.
Okay, so let's read from Lauren's book to Lauren, to us, and then we'll talk about it. So, an instrument of breath and bones. At the age of 29, or 1, at the age of 29, she learned that breathing is hard. Remembered that as a child she had known. She had it known. She simply had breathed. Unapologetically ravenous for air, her belly used to defy gravity. A drum, thirsty for resonance, ribs expanding, uncaged, rippling beneath skin, teeth sucking in breath, in the expectant swirl of a shout, an excited scream, or to usher in the loud silence that punctuates a gasp of awe. An excited scream, or to usher in the loud silence that punctuates a gasp of awe. She had forgotten the depth of her body, shortened her range, lived off small sips taken with shy lips. At the age of 29, she learned that she should breathe like she drinks water, gallons at a time. 2. She sang a tune, floated up from stomach, lungs, throat. She'd sang it before, it had sung her before. Lifted up through the air, a thread strung, her mouth a needle threaded. Notes sewed, skirts out of thin air, unhemmed her insides that fluttered with the tickle of vocal cords. There was something eternal about the air. She recognized the unnameable quality of folk song, a melody that comes from nowhere and speaks to everything. She mused with the idea of this being the voice of the earth, or whatever capitalized word people use to speak of, capital T, that, which we all know is out there, is in here. That which all writing just fails to outline with letters and punctuation, that which all music tries to dance to, which all art brushes upon, sculpts into, builds for, composes with, pencils through, hums for, blueprints and choreographs around. I want to read that. I'll read that 2 more times because this sort of is, it gets to a philosophical conundrum and question that perhaps has no answer, but it's important for us to keep asking. That which all writing just fails to outline with letters and punctuation. That to which all music tries to dance to, which all art brushes upon, sculpts into, builds for, composes with, pencils through, hums for, blueprints and choreographs around. That which all writing just fails to outline with letters and punctuation. That to which all music tries to dance around, which all art brushes upon, sculpts into, builds for, composes with, pencils through, hums for, blueprints and choreographs around. A ribbon lifted, unraveled her spine, creased, soft, untethered. This sound that had made her before rose again. She struggled gently against the tensing, against the calcified fear whose layers seemed to peel endlessly. Befriend it, they say. She said, okay, remembering what they say. They, all of those who touched her where the mineral deposits ossify, that got their fingers ashen with her internal debris, that fumbled kind hands on petrified insides. And this word petrified comes through several poems in this collection. It's a thread. On petrified insides, and helped her feel that what feels like rock is sometimes only chalk. She said, okay, turned her attention from where it tightened to everywhere around, to nowhere really, and opened her mouth. Let sound dissolve a scab of skin that once needed healing, that once needed less feeling. The small tremors make crust crumble for a moment. For a moment she bathes it in an emanation of acoustics and air. The memory of a tune has its own agency. She was afraid she wouldn't remember. Her mind twitched, realizing she didn't know how to write music. But the memory of a tune has its own agency. In that moment it returned, had never left, was always there to be strung. Where do notes come from? Where do they live when they're not sung? She realized the air around her was always pregnant with her voice. She realized the air around her was always pregnant with her voice, and all the music, there for the plucking, the body, an instrument of breath and bones. Poetry!
Thank you for reading that.
That's a journey, that one.
That is a journey. Wow. I heard it in like a new way.
What was that?
It just made me realize, you asked earlier like what I'm doing in Guatemala, and I think this poem feels like the heart, right now it feels like the heart of the book, actually, because it is all about expression and allowing oneself to express, and I speak of music in that one a lot, which I also love because you're a musician, and a lot of my time here around the lake has been focused on music.
I've lost it.
I think it's before...
Okay. I'll let you
Yeah.
find it. Okay.
That
Good.
was
We
one,
found
yeah.
it. Okay. Good.
But basically, yeah, I think what has brought me here started with that poem, which was years ago, 2-3 years ago maybe, and I was getting into my poetry and I realized that I wanted to share it vocally, but I had really bad stage fright. And I started, is this the same one? Perfect. It's like fine wine. I'm like, let's not mix. I started working with this amazing vocal coach called Yulia, and it was a lot of just like inner work. We weren't necessarily singing. It was more like getting over my internal blockages. And after one session, I was just kind of like humming to myself in the kitchen. And I've always loved singing, but I have a pretty, I'm not sure how to call it, like a steady voice. I've never had like a falsetto or anything like that. And in that moment, I think because I'd let out so much like emotion, I was like humming and I heard this like falsetto, and it was like hearing my voice for the first time. Like it wasn't mine, like it was literally my body as an instrument making sound, and I was amazed, but immediately I was like, wait, I want to hear everyone's voice. You know, what do people actually sound like? And from there, the winding journey led me to do more vocal transformation work to like allow myself to express more, whether poetry or actually, you know, just in life with like friends and lovers and family and humans in general. And this past year, I did these 2 vocal transformation retreats with an amazing teacher called Marin Azoff.
And that's how you ended up here, because you met Aviva, who is a resident here in Corona,
Exactly.
so yeah.
Exactly. And I published the book after the first retreat and right before the second retreat, and it was all about just like letting all that out. So I love that you read that, because yeah, being here, I feel like I've done a lot of singing and chanting and stuff, and it's felt like this is exactly what I need to be doing. Yeah.
So a couple of thoughts that come, like the air always being pregnant with your voice, like, so pregnancy being like this latent, not yet arrived state. So like, I think, and hearing what you're saying, so her name is Lauren Ducrey, and the pinned comment takes you to her Amazon page where you could check out her book. Yeah, like, you know, the potentialities that abound all around us. Kanaka, you were at the kirtan on Sunday.
Yeah.
So you saw Kanaka up front. I'm in the middle, the
Yeah.
the Indian woman.
Yes.
And Kanaka talks about how sometimes she feels a poem coming on, but she very rarely writes it down. She usually goes and
Interesting.
dances it out.
Oh,
She'll
wow.
go and like dance, and then it becomes like like none of these poems are gonna last forever because probably in like a billion years the sun's gonna get too hot and eat the earth. So like everything, no matter how much time like things have, like there is always an expiration date, and so it's really beautiful. In poetry, we talked about this habit I have of that I love of writing a poem, making no copy of it, putting it in a bottle, and throwing it into the ocean because it's allows me to let go of something I hold on. I think the artist naturally holds on very tight to. And so it's interesting that you're having this journey with music and voice, because in writing, we talk about voice. We don't mean our speaking voice, but we mean like, you know, like singers have everyone has their own voice. No two singers sound alike in the same way with like writers.
Yeah.
So how is that sort of
writing.
overlapped for you? The voice in your writing and then the voice in your actual speaking and singing voice?
It's a good question. I think doing the vocal work has really helped me get out of my head. Like something that I didn't do for the longest time, even though I think it's like a top writer's trick, is read your written work out loud. And especially with poetry, because it's so musical, you know, it relies on rhythm and phonetics. And I realized how different the voice reading a poem in my mind is to the voice that speaks it out loud. And I think we live most of our lives thinking that the, you know, that like narration inside our mind is the same as this voice.
Yeah.
And it's really
we confuse that voice to bring it to a meditation. A lot of these guys are also into that sphere. That voice that's always going on in our head, we think of as ourselves until we sit down and try to do something else, but listen to it, and then we find out it doesn't stop.
Yeah.
So we're like, if this is me, this voice, and I'm sitting down trying to stop it, what is this and what is me?
Yeah.
Like it leads to those sort of questions.
Yeah, so I think it's helped in my mindfulness journey for sure, realize that kind of like dissonance. And I'm still, how do I put it? I'm still very much in the process of like finding my voice. Like even when I write, sometimes I can tell that I'm kind of thinking of another poet's voice and kind of mimicking that in a certain way. And it's taught me, I think, to be very patient with finding my own voice. Like I don't think I'm going to stumble upon it tomorrow.
Yeah, were you in a hurry to learn patience?
That's a good one. That's really good. Yeah, I am in a hurry in many ways in my life, and poetry has been a practice of patience through and through.
Yeah.
But it's also brought me to want to like write more lyrics or explore. I've been exploring the overlay of my poems with music, but I kind of want to push that further because I feel part of me doesn't believe that I can write lyrics. I'm like, oh, that's like, yeah, it's a thing I couldn't do. But same as like I didn't write poetry before.
Yeah.
So I feel like it's a new edge, a new learning edge that could bring me into more of an immediate form of expression that might get me closer to my own voice and a bit out of that safe space, like comfort zone that I have of like being on the page. I can edit, I can re-edit, you know, like, yeah, get into like a more immediate form of expression.
So I think that's inspiring to, be sitting with a poet, reading her book of poetry, and this isn't something that was a given your whole life. It's something you stumbled into. And what would you say if you had to reduce it? I guess what were the three most compelling prods that brought you from not really interested in poetry, not writing poetry, to putting on a book of poetry?
Putting on a book. Like three things that kind of allowed me.
Yeah, what were the conditions and the prods and like what poked you to do this, I guess? Prompted you.
Yeah.
Like for instance, in my life, my grandma was a poet.
Yeah.
I had been writing poetry before I even called it that as a kid. And I shared with her a poem I wrote with her in mind called Seaside Grace, 2 months before she died. And she gave me really good encouragement that she hoped I continued to do more with it. She hoped that I, put it out in the world. And then when her passing away a few months later, I actually had a plane ticket to visit her, and my visit ended up coinciding with her funeral. So, and then I went to Cuba. I actually took a bunch of her some of you have read my book, The Nomad's Nomad, have read this story, To Cuba with Love. The Catholics put on a great ceremony. I didn't really feel closure from it. So what I did is took a couple of books of her poetry to a place you'd always wanted to go and then like smuggled them onto the shelves. So I had like the energy of death in this trip, and that led to this first book, which kind of opened the door of possibility for the other book. So I can definitely see my grandmother's death as a big prod to like start putting my work out in the world.
Yeah.
What were
I want to
yours?
read that poem of yours afterwards.
Okay.
Yeah, I think like I mentioned the emotional like upheaval of like a breakup, and I think that led to more questioning about kind of like self-identity. It was that big opening, like, okay, who am I kind of thing. And so that was just
That old question, who am I?
Exactly. So just the inevitability of things coming out, and I guess because I had been writing most of my life, like as a kid, I would write poems as like Christmas gifts. I would dip paper in tea to make it look like parchment.
Oh wow, great.
And then I'd write on it and make
What
it
kind
look
of
pretty.
tea were you dipping it in?
I can't remember. Yeah, to kind of make them look like parchment. My parents actually found one of them more recently. They're like, look, you wrote this when you were like, I don't know, 8 or something. So I think that was just a tool that was like just readily available, and you know, having studied pretty hard in school and having that kind of like academic pathway, it was a form of expression that was just available to like work through emotions. I think another element though is living in New York. I don't kind of like comparing like what if I had stayed in France, because I think it's those comparisons don't really, you know.
You can never, they never end.
They never end,
There's
right?
a million maybes.
But that being said, I think growing up in France, there is a regard towards poetry as something very kind of like a bit untouchable, honestly. There's a pantheon of poets, and they're very highly regarded, so it seemed very distant.
And they're usually quite miserable.
Quite miserable, honestly. Also, mainly men. I mean, just like not very relatable, right? And then moving to New York, and I think especially when I started doing workshops, I was like, whoa, most of the people here are like my age, and I was like, what, like 25? And they're like, cool. Like, they're not just like locked up in their dusty, you know, library
Ivory
or whatever,
towers,
ivory towers, exactly. So I think that was a big one that made me realize, like, wait, I don't have to give up other joys that I have in my life to do this, and actually get inspiration from a lot of other people that I could just like be friends with. I think that was a really, really big one for me.
Do you ever read The New Yorker?
Yeah.
So if you guys ever want to read the most insular, cliche group of self-sorrowing people, you can read the poetry of The New Yorker. Well, it's sort of like, something, let's say, we'll catch up on the comments. So Amanda says, when I used to write, I would write it, read it out loud, then usually make changes because it doesn't sound the same as in my head.
Totally can relate to that. Absolutely.
Her name, we went through that.
Thank you for the kind words that I'm seeing here.
Michelle says, there is one more, I just checked. Okay.
If it is in fact sold out on Amazon and you're based in the US, you can also get my book on my website. That just means that I'm the one that is packaging and sending.
Yeah, wouldn't that be great?
So you just need to be a little patient as I'm traveling right now. But yeah, Barnes & Noble should have some, thriftbooks.com as well.
Okay, Marianne says, the two of you are a wonderful bouquet of thoughts and words. How blessed we are to hear your thoughts and reasons. Congratulations to you both on your wonderful accomplishments. Thank you, Marianne.
Thank you.
So, okay, this Thomas says, hey, Thomas from Antigua, amazing, the famous harmonic player. He says, Luke, you howl well. Just ditch the academia. And I feel like that, so I wanted to read that in relation to like my thoughts on the New Yorker. And like I used to every year get like the best American poetry collection that comes out, edited by Paul Newman, I don't know. And I'm always disappointed. I'm always kind of like,
Yeah.
this is not the best American. I'll be like, you know, in recent, I'll be like, I've heard 10 other poets like this year in coffee shops
Yeah.
or on street corners, because it feels like sterile. It feels
Okay.
like poetry written in a surgical room in a hospital to me, because it usually ends with sort of a gloom and a doom. Like the New Yorker, it's not that I'm like, oh, they didn't publish me, so I'm like gonna have it out for them. It's just like, it feels like deep in my soul something's off with it. Like the king is naked and everyone is acting like this. Oh, these are the people. These are the guys. It's like, no, these are just the people that never stopped getting degrees, and then they went from degrees to being professors, and then they went from professors to being editors, and they fancy themselves like, you know, sort of as the gatekeepers, and in some ways they are the gatekeepers. But I find homeless people on street corners can sometimes recite things that draw me in much more than like the clever, cumbersome. You know, in the book, my favorite line from A Gift of the Sea is, "There's nothing more exhausting in the world than insincerity." And I don't think that they're insincere. Like, probably it's all actually, this is just my own story and projection in my head. And if I were to like have tea with them,
Isn't it always?
I think they would be delightful people. But yeah, I think like there isn't, in my estimation, like they're at a higher level than your, you know,
Well,
work.
thank
Like
you.
your work, you know, it reaches to that place and it reaches from that place. And I think this could be, Pablo Picasso once had by, Gertrude Stein once described a Picasso painting as having something being coming out of it.
Having something being.
It's kind of
Coming out of
ungrammatical.
it.
She
Yeah.
looked at the painting and she said, this one has something being coming out of it.
Like with that aliveness of
Uh-huh.
being.
Hmm.
Okay, yeah, yeah.
So I think we're, you know, getting back to like even Mary Oliver, like these really beautiful, simple, like this really short
So
one.
short, yeah.
I'd never been to this country before. No, I didn't know where the roads would lead me. No, I didn't intend to turn back. It's like, you could say that in a much more complicated structure, but do you need to?
Yeah.
And I guess I would not have so much criticism for, say, the ivory tower poets of the New Yorker if I didn't. I mean, I do read it, so there's something that I'm reading it, and if I'm being triggered in any sort of way, it's probably they're succeeding in some way.
Yeah.
But it just seems very uniform. It's like this, they're all like imitating each other instead of trying to figure out what they have to say.
It's interesting you say that because I was just having a conversation with a friend yesterday about, and this relates to the voice.
Mm-hmm.
And I think as humans, we kind of just tend to imitate things that we like, right? So not to blame, but I find sometimes in poetry readings, people also take on the same kind of like prosody, like the same type of rhythm.
Oh, I
and
noticed
the same
that in our
tone.
poetry circle, because we have poets that we all influence one another. And it's
Yeah.
led me to understand why there are like the beat poets, these
Yeah.
scenes of poets where they're all sort of influencing each other and creating a insular in-group voice
Yeah.
for their group. Yeah.
That's kind of inspiring because I was kind of like, oh, it's a shame everybody sounds the same. You know, like I'd love to hear every poet's individual voice in their reading the same way that a singer, not all, there's some singers that'll, you know, have the same kind of like pop voice and play to a certain type. But yeah, it's kind of, this is just making me reflect on like the vocal version of what you're saying, I guess, that of all these New Yorker poems kind of starting to sound the same.
It's like they'll start off with like the classic New Yorker poem. I'll just make it up because it's so patterned. It's like they might start off with something mundane, like them looking at a cereal box at the grocery store, and then that box might trigger a memory from the past which helps explain their current painful state, and then they often end with like a reversal line at the end which brings us into greater resonance with the despair.
Yeah, so there's like a format kind of, or it feels like that.
Yeah, it seems it tends just unnecessarily to negativity.
Okay.
I guess I'm not
Yeah.
overly inspired by negativity. You know, one friend, when he was once having a laugh about me, he was like, oh, the classic Luke story. He'll be like, blah, 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 all this stuff happened, all this bad stuff happened, all this stuff, but it was all okay because we all learned a lesson.
Yeah.
So I tend towards even like wrapping the difficult or the negative in life into some positive spin because, so, I don't know, I wish we had one on hand to rip apart, but let's not waste any more time on these poets. And if you're working at the New Yorker, I don't mean anything, I don't know what I'm saying, I'm just,
We'll get you published in the New Yorker.
I have a stale opinion that has been rotting for years in me about this.
But we were talking previous to starting the live about like joyful poetry, and kind of I think there's this image of the suffering poet and that the inspiration comes from pain. And I really appreciate like the humor of that forward. I think, again, answering your question, like what were some of the prods? I think discovering that poetry can be funny was a big one, because I was like, sure, I think it's an amazing way to get out the like hardships, but also like I like laughing.
Yeah.
You know, can I relate this to parts of my life that aren't just the dark ones?
And can it be deeper than just laughing?
Yes.
Yeah.
And I realized in like going to poetry readings, I was like, this is almost like close, almost like a stand-up, but it's like it's in poetry form, but they're saying things that everybody's laughing out loud, and it's profound because it's speaking to these like I think a good comedian, like these deep truths in life through humor, which makes it easier to think about.
Yeah, I've noticed, like, when I know I'm going to be reading a poem out loud, like the edits that come in, and it's really great actually to have a space weekly that I've had for 2 years in my life to share with others, because it does sort of change. Knowing you're going to be reading it for someone, you want to execute well. Like, you don't necessarily think the same way when it's going to go from your notebook to your book that you're publishing, but when you're going to be reading it for people, like performing it, like performance, I think, is part of the art of poetry. If you're just writing in a notebook and you're not sharing in any way, you're missing maybe even an essential ingredient of this whole world of poetry. And in this day and age, you know, like I started this page just after the pandemic. It wasn't necessarily related, but it was probably a good time to start, you know, opening the door to the internet world as the world was closing. And we can still perform into our phones. Like you guys see me very often getting quite animated reading my poetry, and it's just me and a phone. And you guys want to see your setup? It's pretty funny. You guys are wearing, I don't know if you guys know, but you're wearing a cowboy hat.
Yep.
Because I've learned that
DIY.
my phone can't take the heat. So you guys are wearing Indiana the cowboy hat. It was about the same day as Jones the guitar.
That's good. That's good.
Well, I open it up to you guys. We have a little bit of time left. Gerard says, great content. Nice job, Luke and Lauren. So do you have any questions for Lauren, guys? She's here for a limited time. You're leaving on Monday.
I am.
Yeah.
But I'll be back.
Where you're going to Mazinte?
Costa Rica.
Costa Rica,
Yeah.
okay. So you're on just like your great Central American adventure.
Pretty much.
Wow.
Yeah.
Great, I'm jealous. I did
Soaking
that once.
in
Twice.
soaking in the
three times.
inspiration. Yeah. Yeah, I feel like you got a run of the land.
I've gone up and down a few times,
yeah.
but yeah. All right, so any questions for Lauren? And while we're thinking them up, I invite you to become the interviewer. And
Yes.
maybe grab one of my poems we can talk
Absolutely.
about. And
Do you have the one that you mentioned in that story relating to your grandmother?
Mhm.
I'd love to,
Seaside
read it?
Grace. Okay.
yeah?
It's an older one, so I would have been 24 when I wrote this. And I had my grandma in mind. Like, there's an image of a woman walking along the beach, and I was, you know, the woman is called Grace in this one,
Yeah.
but I was thinking of my grandmother.
Thank you.
And
Is
then
that
it's
Patricia
shaped,
Mies?
Mhm.
How do you pronounce Mies? Yeah.
and it's shaped like waves. That's
Yeah.
why it's formatted that way.
Yeah, it's really beautiful. I love playing with formatting in poems. All right, Seaside Grace.
So she doesn't have a Facebook page, but you can find at Lauren. Well, she does have a personal one, but she might be creeped out if you guys all send a friend request. So Lauren Ducrey on Instagram.
Yeah, Instagram is where I share most of my poetry stuff, more so than Facebook. So Seaside Grace, in memory of Patricia Mies Armstrong. Like post-orgasmic peace, the living waves, slaves to you not so neutral moon, slave to earth, home to you, admired waves. A green, ripe opening, unlit fires of night, hazy inspiration, not so far from the truth. All ice cubes will one day be sea foaming surf, to be sliced right open, again, water mending wounds. The hermit crab's home rests between two sea-tanned breasts, which through a series of perfect parts connects the two traveled feet, leaving hopeless prints on ever-washing sands. A song of one sound sets tempo in her musical ears. A song of one sound sets tempo in her musical ears. The washing cleanses what harm it brings. Scores of voices who have never turned her down mix water without words under a late light sky. So see the orange blued of the set and rise. Imagine what's behind the curtain of a green silk skirt, and trade a day to pass away in a moment of minutes outside itself and beside itself with grace. The fall, the quiet spectacle when dust-bound leaves wash onto sandy shores, youthful romantic wings, castles, not lasting a day, are testaments to eternal life. Temporary empires composed of the eroded walls of you. Rome, grace, before a meal of lightly treading thoughts is a welcomed guest before a crashing company of waves, sinking forever into the boundless sands below. Wow, I want to read that like 5 times over.
Right.
There's so much going on.
And for me, it's just like an image of my grandma walking along the beach, which was a place I think she always found herself most fully in.
Was she musical?
She listened to Cat Stevens.
Okay.
She didn't play an instrument, just sing, no.
Because I did get, that one, like, a song of one sound sets tempo in her musical ears. That makes me want to ask you, as a musician and a poet, what's the conversation between your writing music and your writing poetry?
I'm not sure. I know they both help each other. It's interesting sort of how differently they inhabit. Like when I'm writing music, usually first I'm coming either on the guitar or the piano, I'm playing something, and then I'm writing music. So very rarely am I writing lyrics and then putting music to it. And sometimes I feel like I ought to do that more, but then I guess the refinement I learn as a writer, I've been very glad to watch myself bring that same craftsmanship to the songs. I sort of realized as I was putting out, you guys have seen the albums that I've recently put out, I've been realizing that my songs ought to go through the same sort of drafting process that I put my writing through. And so really getting into the fine lines, the thin threads, and really spending more time in a refinement process. And that's led me to do some cool things. It's led me to write in like key changes and stuff like that. And sometimes I feel, wouldn't it be great to just be a poet or just a musician, just a songwriter? But they're both very related and inseparable to me. And I'm also very blessed to be in so many realms, I guess, when it comes to writing.
Yeah.
And yeah, to have that, they're related in a, I'm not quite sure type way, but I know that they have helped each other a lot. Because like you were saying before, like there is a fine line between music and poetry. And one poem that I once read that kind of encapsulates this says basically that music, poetry must do the same transformation. Poetry to be poetry must transform us from the inside in the same way that music does, but it has to do it without music.
Yes. I remember you shared that.
So
Yeah.
that's maybe it's a mixture. Music can be poetry, and indeed, like you
Yeah.
know, Aviva at our last poet tea, she read the lyrics of a song that if she didn't tell us was a song, we would have just assumed was a poem. So it's like
Totally.
if you're reading the lyrics of a song that, you know, in a real, without getting overly complicated, it's like a song is a poem sung to a melody.
I like that. Yeah.
We could certainly philosophize for hours, and I know I spend much of my life doing such a thing, but we can also then, you know,
Do the thing.
just be like simple
out.
with it and not overcomplicate things. And that's sort of what Mary Oliver does in her poetry. And you can certainly,
Yeah.
you know, if you were here at the beginning of the broadcast, you can take, I ate a big hamburger and make it much more than that, like weave a whole lot into it. Or you could just say like I ate a hamburger. Lori Ann asks, do you feel that you are more inspired to pen a poem in solitude and silence or in the noise of life?
It's a great
Let
question.
you field that first.
Yeah. I want to hear your answer as well on that one. I think I tend to mainly have a poetry practice steeped in solitude. Like I very much need like my desk and my notebook or my computer to kind of focus. I think that's also just a habit inherited from like being a diligent student. And actually, over these past couple of months traveling, it hasn't necessarily been that easy to find that space because when you're moving around, you don't necessarily, you know, have your appointed desk. And I've explored just writing things down on my phone and trusting that like the words will come, and they have, which has been a really lovely experience of being like, okay, you don't need to be like so hard on like the discipline and trust that sometimes you're just walking down a street in a new, really inspiring place, and phones are nice in that sense. Or it could be a notebook, but I found just like typing on my phone is a bit easier when I'm moving and walking. So moving towards the bustling poetry, I would say. How about you?
Yeah, definitely. I love this. I get little sparks of pieces in the, as to borrow from the poem Desiderata, in the noisy confusion of life. Like I'll be in the shower and I'll reach for my phone that's playing music in the shower, because that's like why I came to this earth, is to listen to music while hot water falls on me. That's like, there's nothing else I want to do.
Your
I want to go
purpose.
back there right now. I was there earlier today. So, but in order to refine those things into something, those grains, those simplicities of truth, like I think, you know, this ended up in all the beloved known things. This line, if you're wondering where to begin, you already have. Like I think that was just scribbled
Love
in a
that.
notebook in
Yeah.
the noisy confusion of life, and then refined later. So I think you can. The easiest way to answer it I find I can be inspired in an instant and write something down, and most of the time I'll never revisit it, never do anything with it. But oftentimes then I can take that which emerged without me trying to bring anything about, sit down at my desk in the space that I've cultivated over decades, right? The writing space, the writing time, and then refine it that way. And interestingly enough, 6 years ago, you would have found me in Southeast Asia. I turned 36 years ago in Southeast Asia, and as I was diving deeper into meditation and finding more centeredness and sort of inner stillness than I even knew like humans were capable of, so less sort of ADHD spasticness, I had a fear.
Yes.
I had like a fear that this path of meditation was going to interfere with my
Totally.
spastic creativity.
Yeah.
but it wasn't the case. It actually, I'm just more disciplined, more able to execute and deliver on what I hope to. And a quiet mind is not an unartistic or uncreative mind. It's actually just a focused mind, like a laser blade or laser beam. So I have like this box of, maybe you have one, like this box of notebooks in my parents'
Yeah.
attics.
Full of
Things. And I remember two different experiences when I always visit the box when I visit my parents in the attic. And I remember feeling a sense of loss because I was going through like this notebook of, you know, all these things I had written and
Harvesting.
half-written poems and half-written short story. And I realized in the moment of penning these, this was the priority that I imagined would one day come to life, be a fully fleshed out poem, be a finished book, a finished short story. And I realized, you know, in my mid-30s visiting this box with still as much pendant on my plate and my desk and new ideas that I wanted, I realized the vast majority of these things were never going to be revisited, were never going to be finished. And I felt a little sad about that. It was like I'm visiting a graveyard of premature babies would be the best like analogy to how it felt.
Yeah.
But the next visit, I felt completely different. I felt like this was the fertile ground from which the flowers that I did put out in the world bloomed. Because I've always been seen as fairly prolific amongst my peers in terms of what I'm producing and putting out in the world. And, you know, you realize most of what you do fiddle with probably won't make it, or maybe won't make it to that final. But, like, the stuff that does is your favorite amongst it.
Yeah.
Like, you only have so much time. That's what I'm certainly learning as I grow is,
Yeah.
like, the time is now. We have no time to lose, and what we put off for tomorrow will likely never come forth or come true.
Yeah.
So,
I love that. Yeah, definitely can relate to the sparks of inspiration coming and then sitting down and editing them. That's what most of my notebooks are filled with, like a nugget, a little gem that needs refining.
and then the practice of writing, like the craftsmanship of writing, this is the one thing I really like. This is the biggest advantage of these writers retreats I do, which if you guys are interested, April 18th to the 22nd, we're taking an adventure to the tea plantation I went to in Coban for the 9th edition, or were we at the 8th? Something like that edition of Writing Your Dreams Come True. But what I think is most important for people is nothing I teach, nothing I convey. It's that we have scheduled 10 blocks of writing blocks. One's an hour and a half. And we surround those blocks with creative inspiration, and we declare to our peers, the first block of the 9 is just scheduling the other 9. And most times people are like, no, but I just want to write, I want to do this. I'm like, no, schedule the next 9 blocks. And then your job in this retreat is to do, if you said you're going to do this for your project or your book or whatever, I've had songwriters, poetry writers, novel writers, nonfiction writers, memoir writers. If you scheduled that you were going to write a first draft of chapter 4 on block number 5, regardless of all the other new things your mind wants to do, your only job is to do with what you said you were going to do when you made your schedule on the first day. And that's kind of how I've learned to operate my writing week. I'll schedule like 3 or 4 writing blocks on a Sunday night. This is me and my ideal. I don't always do this. But on a Sunday night, I'm like scheduling in the coming week and looking at what I have to do. I'm saying, okay, this time, and that time I can write. And this is what I'm going to do that's important. And then just learning to sit your butt down and do it even though you don't want to do it, with some exceptions. Like if, you know, we don't want to be masochistic with ourselves, but we also don't want to let ourselves off the hook easy, because if we can't, why it's potent in the writers' retreats is they have all their peers to hold them accountable.
Yeah.
So there's like 6 other people in the retreat. They said they were going to write chapter 4. Yeah. And then that evening they're going to share with everyone what they did and like have to share with everyone how the block went. And nobody wants to say, I just went on Facebook the whole time, even though I'm paying for this retreat and this writer's block. So that alone teaches people to, you know, writing is work. And like Anne Lamott is great in her book Bird by Bird. It doesn't necessarily get easier, but we get better at doing the difficult. With practice.
It's practice. Like that's something I learned along the way. It was like, it's like meditation practice. It's like going to the gym. It's like painters painting the same landscape like 25 times over until like you get to that point of ease, or like
I think of
athletes.
Corot in, like, what is it, the Italian countryside, painting
Yeah.
the same mountain 1,000 times.
It's like you, from as like a spectator, you're like, oh yeah, they just like do it. No.
No,
No.
there's very few writers or creators or musicians that, we all have that inspiration that can fill notebooks, but only a few of us will have the discipline to become the craftsman or craftswoman, craft person, that finesses. Like, it's all about the finessing. Even my novel that, like, I finished this 9 years ago. Final draft, redrafted, but I learned a lot in the last 9 years as a craftsman, not as an inspired creator, because I actually couldn't write. I realized when I was refining this that I could not write this book from where I'm at right now in life. My perspective just wouldn't be able to convey this, because we're always sort of changing our view of the world as we grow. So I was very grateful I got this down when I did. And I was also very grateful I didn't publish it when I finished it back then, because I saw that I had grown a lot as a craftsman, not as an artist. Like, I think, the artist in us is just there, and it's how well we nurture that inner artist, how well we give it permission to, you're talking about performance and that you were a little intimidated by it. It's good to put ourselves in those situations, and what's helped me in them is like the fact that I'm gonna die one day, and all of you are gonna die one day. So what do I have? What skin do I really have in the game? Oh, embarrassment! Somebody, like someone's thoughts in somebody else's head. But that's also been a process for me. It wasn't. I haven't always been there, but the more you put yourself in those situations, the easier it becomes.
Yeah. And you used a word that brought up a really good kind of spin on this idea of working at the craft that my teacher Marin shared with us. She was talking about discipline, and she's like, discipline gets a really bad rap as this, like, you must do your homework at this time, like something that you don't want to do, right? But she's like, it's the same root as like disciple, right? And you think of, I don't know, Jesus' disciples. They were his disciples because they loved him and they respected, and there was nothing more important than to listen and learn and follow what he taught. And I was like, whoa, like reframing instead of Jesus, like poetry. The discipline isn't this kind of like, you better write it. It's like, what is more important to me than this thing that I love? Absolutely. Suddenly it's easier to sit down and take those 2 hours and actually respect your schedule, because you're doing it out of love instead of like this like threat of punishment or external, external forces.
That's sort of what's always brought me to the fiction writing again and again, is when I start to fall in love with these characters, and I feel a deep debt, maybe is not the right word, but I feel a deep, it's like you become a servant of poetry, you become a servant of music, you become a servant of work, and that frees us, right? The Tao Te Ching has it, do your work and then step back, the only path to serenity. So I often find that if I don't do my writing block early in the morning while we're still in silence here at Karuna, because from 10 p.m. to 8 a.m. nobody's allowed to talk to anyone. We're like Nazis here. But if I can do it before that time, then I'm not troubled throughout the day trying to like pull myself away from real human interactions, because I think the interesting thing about the artist is they need sort of this solitude, and like, my family didn't always understand like, the empaths in the world and they're needing to withdraw. I come from a family with 9 siblings, so a lot of commotion, and it would be like family games, and then like kind of a pattern of mind would be to kind of just slip away and to go into my room and do my own thing. And subsequently I've been able to understand myself and articulate my needs and boundaries, and that's been a very blissful journey for myself. But but before I didn't have the vocabulary, and so I would be told by other members of my family, like, we're all having fun and you're just like, kind of like selfishly off doing your own thing. But it's sort of like, well, I need this time and space, and when I am in this chaotic 9 siblings and now like a lot of them have kids. I just sometimes need that moment. And for me, it's that morning where if I can get my centering practices and some writing, some real artistry done, then I feel like I can give myself to the rest of the day. From like 8 a.m. to 10 p.m. I can be go, 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 and I don't feel compromised because, and so then I see as well for who I am, it's important for me to have that space, not just for me or for the art, but for the people in my life. Because I don't want to walk around resentful that everyone's taking the time I'd rather be putting to my art. So it becomes quintessential that I give myself that time and space to feel the balance that I need to feel like I'm fulfilling my purpose in this world. Because if we don't feel we have a table to bring our gifts to in this world, I think then we fall into Thoreau's quiet desperation. Thoreau wrote, most men, he meant women too, so we'll just update the gender. Most people lead lives of quiet desperation and die with the song still on their lips.
Songs,
people
the poems.
lead lives of quiet desperation and die with the song still on their lips. So the encouragement to you guys is like, what have you got to lose? If you want to learn a musical instrument, like you're the youngest you'll ever be today. So
I love that.
Start today.
I love that.
Take the guitar off the wall. Get back to the piano. Like open your notebook. And if that's not you, then that's not you, boo. Don't worry about it. You know, but I think as writers, we definitely appreciate readers as well. You know, those who don't even write, but like have an appreciation for the writing that is happening. So, any final words, Lauren?
I think that's perfect.
Well, thank you so much, everyone. Let's just read some quiet final comment. Leanne says, I feel everyone needs that quiet time for themselves for sure. Aho. Leanne also says, Eminem uses notebooks and jots things down to form his music and poetry. Lori says, 2 wonderful answers. And thank you, Amanda. Yeah, thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Thank you, Lauren, for you don't have much time left at the lake, so thank you for making time for this. And the book's really good, guys. So
thank you. This was such an inspiring conversation, truly. Thank you.
Right back at you. Have a good day, everyone. We'll likely, on the Karuna page, do a live video of the circus that is coming to our town. So.
Thank you, everyone.
Hariam.